Welcome back to AI for the Humanities. I'm Meghan McInnis-Domínguez, Professor of Spanish at the University of Delaware, and this is your news roundup covering what happened in AI from April through July 12, 2026 that matters for humanists. It's been a dense few months. We had one of the fastest model release cycles on record, a cluster of copyright cases that go straight to the heart of authorship and creative labor, a split-screen moment in education policy, and a quieter governance story that deserves more attention than it got. I'm going to do this the way I usually do. I'll tell you what happened first, and then I'll stop and ask what this means for how we teach reading, writing, interpretation, and the humanities in general. Let's get into it. On April 16th, Anthropic shipped Claude Opus 4.7. 7 days later, on the 23rd, OpenAI released ChatGPT 5.5, which took the top spot on independent reasoning benchmarks within the week. But by the end of April, 5 different labs, including DeepSeek, Kimi, Johnny's Mimo, had all crossed a new performance ceiling in the same single month. In early April, Anthropic also launched something called Project Glasswing, giving roughly 50 partner organizations, including Apple, Google, Microsoft, and NVIDIA, restricted access to a new model tier called Claude Mythos for defensive cybersecurity research only. Then, on June 9th, Anthropic released 2 new models publicly, Claude Fable 5 and Claude Mythos 5. 3 days later, on the 12th, the U.S. Department of Commerce imposed export controls that forced Anthropic to suspend both models entirely, worldwide, with roughly 90 minutes notice to comply. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and VentureBeat, the directive traces back to Amazon researchers who found a way to prompt Fable 5 into producing information useful for cyber attacks and flagged it to the White House, reportedly following direct conversations between Amazon's CEO and administration officials. Anthropic disputed that the underlying weakness was unique to its models, but complied while working to fix it. The restoration happened in 2 distinct steps, not one. On June 26th, 2 weeks out into the suspension, the government allowed Anthropic to restore access to Mythos 5, but only for a limited set of vetted U.S. organizations inside Project Glasswing. Fable 5 itself stayed fully offline. It wasn't until June 13th, when the Commerce Department formally lifted the export control license requirement, that Fable 5 came back. And even then, only starting July 1st, the same day Anthropic made a different model, Claude Sonnet 5, its new default. Mythos 5 remains limited to the same vetted group of US organizations to this day. The cadence didn't let up going into July. On July 8th, xAI released Grok 4.5, its first model since finalizing its acquisition of the coding tool Cursor, trained in part on real Cursor developer session data. Musk described it as an Opus-class model, but faster, more token efficient, and lower cost. xAI's own published benchmark chart tells a more careful story than the quote suggests. Grok 4.5 beats Opus 4.8 on 2 of the 4 benchmarks xAI chose to publish, and it loses on the other 2. It's genuinely cheap, at roughly a third of Opus 4.8's price, and is genuinely token efficient, using about a quarter as many output tokens to solve the same coding task. It's not yet available in the EU. The most important release of the week, though, was one that never should have surprised anyone paying attention to the Anthropic story. On June 26th, OpenAI previewed its new GPT 5.6 family, 3 models named Sol, Terra, and Luna, but only to roughly 20 organizations whose participation had been shared with the US government. OpenAI said the gating was at the government's explicit request, tied specifically to the model's cybersecurity capabilities. The review, conducted in part by the Commerce Department's Center for AI Standards and Innovation, cleared faster than the window allowed, and OpenAI opened GPT 5.6 to the public on July 9th. In its own announcement, OpenAI stated directly that it does not believe this kind of government access process should become the long-term default, because it keeps capable tools out of the hands of users, developers, and cyber defenders who need them. So, what does this mean for the humanities? Start with the compression. When 5 companies clear the same performance bar in 4 weeks, that bar stops functioning as a meaningful signal of what a degree, a certification, or a credential actually certifies. If a model can pass an expert-level exam on command, the question a humanities classroom needs to be asking is not whether AI can do this. It's what a test score was ever supposed to measure in the first place, and whether the thing it was meant to measure, judgment developed under real conditions of consequence, is still being taught anywhere by anyone on purpose. That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's a genuine circular problem. If assessment has been quietly measuring information recall for decades and calling it expertise, AI has just made that quietly false, and we are the discipline best equipped to say so out loud. Now sit with the export control sequence, because it's not just a technology story. It's a story about who gets to decide what counts as a national security risk, on what evidence, and with what appeal process. The commercial product went dark for nearly 3 weeks because of a licensing determination made behind closed doors, and then came back because that determination changed, also behind closed doors, with no public explanation offered either time. For anyone teaching the history of export controls or the relationship between private companies and state power, this is a live case study happening in real time. Students who have only studied Cold War-era export restrictions on cryptography or satellite technology now have a contemporary parallel sitting in the news, and the pedagogical opportunity is to ask them the same question historians ask of any archive. What decisions were made? By whom? On what stated grounds? And what grounds were left unstated? And now we have a second data point in the same 3-week window. OpenAI's GPT 5.6 followed nearly the identical arc: preview to a government-vetted group, a formal safety review, then public release. And OpenAI's own public statement pushed back on the process, even while complying with it. When two competing companies hit the same government gate within weeks of each other, that stops looking like an isolated incident and starts looking like the emerging shape of how frontier AI reaches the public. That is exactly the kind of pattern an historian would flag as the beginning of a new regulatory regime, not a one-off. And notice the rhetorical move in Musk's Grok 4.5 framing, because it's worth naming directly for a rhetoric or media studies course. Opit's class is a comparison chosen by the company being compared against its own competitor, benchmarked selectively, and delivered as a soundbite before the underlying chart is available for anyone to check. That's not dishonest exactly. It's advertising copy wearing the clothes of a technical claim. And separating the two is a skill our students will need for the rest of their working lives in a media environment where every company launch increasingly looks like this one. This is not a new problem, and it's worth giving students the historical shape of it. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, computer chip makers marketed raw clock speed, megahertz, as if it were a direct measure of a processor's real-world performance. Period historians of technology now call the megahertz myth. It took years, and a competitor willing to build a chip that ran at a lower clock speed but outperformed the competition on actual tasks before the industry and consumer press stopped treating the single number as the whole story. AI benchmark marketing is walking the same path right now: a single number, a single quote, a single chart chosen by the company being measured. The lesson from the megahertz era is not that the number is meaningless. It's that a number chosen and reported by the seller needs a second, independent source before it functions as evidence rather than advertising. Back in January, a coalition of music publishers led by Concord and Universal sued Anthropic, alleging the company illegally downloaded more than 20,000 copyrighted songs, including lyrics and sheet music, through BitTorrent from pirate sites, seeking damages that could exceed $3 billion. On April 22nd, Anthropic filed a motion for summary judgment in that case, arguing that training Claude on song lyrics is transformative and therefore protected as fair use. The publishers disagree, and this case is still working its way through the court as of this recording. What's useful here is the precise legal distinction the case turns on, because it's a distinction worth putting directly in front of students. This case is not asking whether AI training on copyrighted text can ever be fair use. A separate case study already establishes that training on legally acquired books can qualify. This case is asking whether the method of acquisition, mass torrenting from privacy sites, taints everything built afterwards, regardless of what information happens downstream. That's a genuinely interesting question for anyone who teaches source use and academic integrity, because it separates two things students usually collapse into one. What did you do with the material, and how you got the material in the first place? A paper can be brilliantly original in its argument and still be built on a source that you stole. Ask students which failure they think matters more and why, and you'll get a real conversation. What's useful here is the precise legal distinction the case turns on, because it's a distinction worth putting directly in front of students. This case is not asking whether AI training on copyrighted text can ever be fair use. A separate case study already establishes that training on legally acquired books can qualify. This case is asking whether the method of acquisition, mass torrenting from privacy sites, taints everything built afterwards, regardless of what information happens downstream. That's a genuinely interesting question for anyone who teaches source use and academic integrity, because it separates two things students usually collapse into one. What did you do with the material, and how you got the material in the first place? A paper can be brilliantly original in its argument and still be built on a source that you stole. Ask students which failure they think matters more and why, and you'll get a real conversation. On May 5th, 5 major publishing houses, Hachette, Macmillan, McGraw-Hill, Elsevier, and Cengage, joined best-selling author Scott Turow in a class action lawsuit against Meta and Mark Zuckerberg personally, alleging Meta trained its Llama models on millions of pirated books and journal articles downloaded from sites like LibGen and Anna's Archive. The complaint alleges that after releasing the first version of Llama, Meta briefly considered paying for licensing deals with publishers, budgeting as much as $200 million for it, and then, in April 2023, abruptly reversed course. One internal quote in the complaint has a Meta employee saying, "If we license a single book, we won't be able to lean into the fair use strategy." Turow's public statement borrowed a line from journalist Alex Reisner, saying, "The promised future of AI has been built with stolen words." This case is worth showing students in full, not summarized, because it makes the abstraction of training data into something concrete and documented. These are named books. Turow's own novel, Presumed Innocent, is listed among the allegedly infringed works. This is a named author whose books have sold 40 million copies in a lawsuit against a company whose CEO personally, according to the complaint, authorized the decision to pirate rather than pay. For a class discussing authorship, ask this directly. Does it change your assessment of the ethics here that Meta considered and rejected a legitimate path, licensing, specifically because paying would have undermined a legal argument it wanted to make later? This is a company choosing infringement as a strategy, not stumbling into it as an oversight. The distinction between negligence and strategy is one your students will use for the rest of their professional lives in contexts that have nothing to do with AI. On June 13th, the Supreme Court declined to let the Trump administration remove Shira Perlmutter, the U.S. Register of Copyrights, from her position, leaving her in place while her legal challenge continues. Perlmutter was fired the day after her office released a report concluding that some uses of copyrighted material to train generative AI may not qualify as fair use. Her attorneys argue the firing was retaliation for that finding. The administration disputes that characterization, but has not offered an alternative explanation for the timing. The federal appeals court had already found the firing likely unlawful, with the majority opinion comparing it to a president trying to fire a federal judge's law clerk over the substance of the advice the clerk gave. This is the story I think deserves the most classroom time this quarter because of what's actually being contested. This is not a policy disagreement being fought against the usual channels, hearings, public comment, legislation. It's a fight over who is allowed to hold the office that interprets copyright law for the entire federal government, playing out specifically because that office reached a conclusion the executive branch didn't like. For a course on the history of intellectual property, or on the separation of powers, or on what happens when technology outpaces the institutions built to govern it, this is a clean case that you will find of law and politics colliding over the exact question we ask every semester in a humanities classroom. Who gets to decide what counts as legitimate use of someone else's work? Normally, that question gets debated in journals and court opinions over years. Here, the person whose job to answer it got fired over her answer, and the Supreme Court just said, for now, she stays. Ask your students what it would mean structurally for that outcome to have gone any other way. There is a legal precedent worth naming here for students. This dispute sits in a lineage that runs through Myers versus the United States in 2026 and Humphreys Executor versus the United States in 1935, two Supreme Court cases that drew the line between officials the president can remove at will and officials Congress has insulated from that power because their function is quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial rather than purely executive. Perlmutter's lawyers are making essentially the Humphreys Executor argument that the Copyright Office sits inside the legislative branch and its register serves a function closer to an independent advisor than a political appointee. Whether that argument ultimately prevails is still an open question. What is not open is the pattern. Every generation revisits where that line falls, usually because a president tests it against an official who produced an inconvenient finding. The AI training data report is this generation's version of a fight that is more than a century old. On June 19th, Norway's Prime Minister announced a near total ban on generative AI tools for students in grades 1 through 7, ages 6 to 13, effective when the school year begins in late August. Students 14 to 16 can use AI only under direct teacher supervision. Students 17 or older are expected to learn responsible use and preparation for higher education. Alongside the ban, the government is increasing funding for physical books in classrooms. The stated reasoning was that children need to learn to read, write, and do mathematics before AI is introduced, so they don't skip the developmental steps where that learning happens. This follows an earlier smartphone ban in Norwegian schools that reportedly produced measurable improvements in test scores and reductions in bullying. Hold this against the Norway story. American college students, several years further along in their education than Norwegian first graders, are living with the consequence of not having had a protected developmental floor, scrambling now to guess which human capacities will still be valued once the automatable ones are gone. Neither country's approach is obviously correct, but Eva Lawless's instinct that studio art, a discipline built around a process AI cannot yet fully substitute, might be a safer bet. And it's the argument for the humanities that isn't coming from humanities departments. It's coming from an anxious data science major doing her own cost-benefit analysis. That argument might land with students in a way that our own advocacy for our disciplines never quite does, because it isn't advocacy, it's just her math. On April 27th, the Associated Press ran a story about American college students trying to choose what one student called an AI proof major, and finding that no one, including their own academic advisors, can tell them what that is. The piece follows Josephine Timperman at Miami University, who switched out of business analytics because the entry-level skills she was learning felt automatable. It follows a University of Chicago computer science graduate who applied to 50 software engineering jobs without a single interview and pivoted to a master's degree. And it follows Ava Lawless at the University of Virginia, a data science major who is now considering switching to studio art, her minor, because she cannot get a straight answer about whether her major is safe. The panic phase of AI in education is ending. The harder, slower work of figuring out what good training actually looks like and whether teachers even want it is just beginning, and it is nowhere close to finished. That reluctance figure matters. 37% of teachers either unwilling or barely willing is not a rounding error. It's more than a third of the workforce that's supposed to be implementing this. Any humanities department building its own AI policy this year should treat that number as a caution against assuming consensus where none exists. Faculty resistance to AI in the classroom isn't automatically technophobia. Sometimes it's a considered judgment that deserves the same respect we give any other professional disagreement. Education Week reported on May 18th that teacher training on AI has grown substantially, with the share of teachers reporting at least some professional development jumping from 13% in 2023 to a clear majority now. But the same reporting found the training uneven in both frequency and depth. And a national survey conducted in February and March found 13% of teachers still not eager at all to integrate AI into their teaching, with another 24% only slightly eager. Put this directly to your students as a question rather than an answer, because Usher is right that most of us make this argument from inside our own interest, and that's worth naming. If two regions with equally serious higher education systems are drawing opposite conclusions from the same technology, that's not evidence that one side has the data wrong. That's evidence that the claim AI makes the humanities more essential is doing rhetorical work as much as descriptive work, the same kind of work we asked students to notice in the Grok 4.5 marketing earlier this episode. If we want that claim to hold up, we need to be able to say specifically what humanities training does that a technically trained but AI fluent workforce cannot, not just assert that it matters more now. That's a harder argument to make than the one we usually make, and it's the one that this moment actually requires. On June 2nd, Representatives Jay Obernolte and Lori Trahan released a discussion draft of the Great American Artificial Intelligence Act of 2026. Section 121 of the bill, titled Federalization of State Laws Regulating Artificial Intelligence Model Development, would bar any state or local government from enforcing a law that specifically regulates the development of an AI model, on the grounds that AI development is, in the bill's words, a matter of national economic significance and international competitiveness requiring uniform federal oversight. The provision is narrower than a blanket ban on state AI law. It explicitly does not preempt state laws of general applicability, does not touch state regulation of what happens after a model is deployed, meaning use, distribution, or the products built on top of a model, and includes a 3-year sunset clause unless Congress affirmatively renews it. The careful boundary drawn here, development versus deployment, is worth putting directly in front of students because it's a distinction our field already knows well from debates over other technologies. The federal government is claiming the upstream act of building a model as its exclusive territory, while leaving the downstream act of using one, where most of the harm to any individual actually happens, to the states. That's not a neutral line. It's a choice about where regulatory friction is most costly to industry versus where it's most protective of the public. And it is worth asking students directly which side of that line looks more like the printing press and which looks more like the newspaper. This is also, notably, still a discussion draft, not a bill with a number that has been formally introduced. That distinction matters for anyone teaching how legislation actually moves. A discussion draft is a trial balloon released to gauge reaction and invite negotiation before its sponsors commit to the harder work of an introduced bill. 3 threads ran through everything we covered today. Who gets to decide what a model is allowed to do, whether that's an export control regulator or a court weighing fair use? Who gets credited and paid when a machine is built out of human creative work, whether that's a songwriter, a novelist, or the country's own copyright office? And who gets to decide what a childhood or a college major or a career is still for, once a machine can do parts of it faster than a person can learn to? None of these are new questions. They're the oldest questions the humanities have. What's new is the speed at which they're arriving, And the fact that this time we don't get to study them after the fact, we're answering them in real time in the classroom this semester or next semester. Thank you for joining me. If this was useful, please like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague working through the same questions. I'll see you next time.
Push the line. Opus to 5-5, racing out of time. 50 partners get the key, nobody else can turn. A model built for safety, but who says where the borders burn? Turned on, turned off, turned on again. A signature from commerce, a stroke of someone's pen. 3 weeks dark, then the lights come back. Who draws the map and who gets left off the track? We built the machine to sing our songs back to us. 20,000 titles, torrented, not discussed. A publisher's asking who gets paid for the ghost in the wire. And the woman who wrote the report is the one they tried to fire. A student switches majors, looking for solid ground. Norway locks the classroom door before the words are found. 6 years old and reading, no machine to fill the gap. Somewhere an ocean over, they're drawing a different map. Turned on, turned off, turned on again. A signature from commerce, a stroke of someone's pen. Built the machine to sing our songs back to us. A new one drops in July, calls itself the best Opus class, they say. But who's grading the test? Every launch, a headline, every headline.